Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Darkness Falls 2003. This movie came out. Um, a lot of people will probably call this movie just the Tooth Fairy movie. A lot of people remember this movie as that simply. Uh, or a lot of people will probably call Matilda Dixon's character the Tooth Fairy because you kind of just really have to just say that it's something like that. Funny enough, how we really don't have any horror movies that had much to do with the Tooth Fairy or anything like that. Um, like until maybe like Hellboy 2, where we technically had some characters in there that were quasi like the Tooth Fairy. But going into this film, I actually really still enjoy this movie. It's still a movie that does hold up. You could go out of your way to find this movie on HBO Max if you dare, in fact, don't have the conveniency to be able to go and download that app and pay that eventual fee. Honestly, you could probably go into a number of apps that probably have this. I would assess or assume. You can go into an app that I've been using fairly reliably called Fox HD Movies. You can search that through Google Play, and eventually the Google the app logo will say so, but the title will say something different, and then you'll easily be able to seemingly watch this movie. I'm assuming and more. Or you could probably go into a number of other apps that I've been using, TV Crushes, and all kinds of stuff that I'm using through my time here. Eventually, you'll find some random thing that I've suggested at some point besides a normal app to conveniently use. So, I liked this movie, and I still enjoy and like this movie, because really, this honestly, this movie would probably like fit a little bit better if it was like a boogeyman thing instead of a tooth fairy thing. But like, oh well, it's the tooth fairy. Plus, there has to be some kind of connection or reason for eventually the monstrous character to go after the certain individual characters, which is to be the kids, and then to consistently haunt them and stalk them for the rest of their days. So, man, but I really enjoy this movie. It still holds up. It's still a good movie. I still like it. And I was surprised that otherwise HBO Max had it. I'm like, yeah, like, thank God they have this movie, so I can easily and conveniently watch it. Because I actually like this movie. It's so good. Because really, we have the most simplistic element of you're afraid of the darkness. And then there's the element of like, well, just freaking just hold a flashlight uh, to your chest or to your bate, and boom, like nothing's gonna hurt you. It kind of brings back those old kind of fashioned kind of ways of which that a lot of people would, of course, when they're younger, eventually be afraid of the dark. Some people still are up until their ripe old age of whatever the heck. So this movie also goes and talks about night terrors, which is a rare thing for movies. Like, rarely do we get that off ever really happening. We might get like a Nightmare on Elm Street kind of thing that probably goes into that maybe somewhere. It's been a while since I busted out a Nightmare on Elm Street thing. Um, but like the things that we end up kind of going into here are so rare, and this movie came out in 2003, and still like there's been a severe rarity of this kind of film. Like, I think the movie is really just good enough to eventually have like garnered us to like continue to do this kind of film because it's fun. But it seems like they kind of got rid of the villain and this character by the end of this movie. But still, you could have just rebooted it, remade it. You could have just had it not be the thing where the character wins in the end, or the villain gets vanquished in the end. They just come up with some kind of nerfing agent to eventually allow this villainous character to eventually get sequels. But again, I would have liked there to have just been like a boogeyman character, not a tooth fairy character. It like there's a bunch of that just like seems very weird. But it is what it is. Because I think if it was like a boogeyman movie, I think that this would have really like kept on, and people would have probably like built a franchise around this thing. Because I think a Tooth Fairy movie just kind of like what a goofy concept. Um, but yeah, I enjoy this movie. It's so much fun because we end up having a character that was to have never really beaten his problem, and so his problem was solved by just turning on a flashlight and or eventually just keeping lights on 24/7, and so he strategically is living the rest of his life. Uh, but here is also the weird thing that on the opposite side of things that I will have to complain about. We have certain places that are to seemingly lose power, which you would never think in the world that these places would lose power, aka the hospital. A hospital would never lose power, or like their emergency lights would not lose this kind of power so quickly. This does not make sense. They're really just kind of doing this just for the fact that they just need something exciting to keep you interested in the film and make you think that these people are eventually going to die or get killed or whichever. Like it's just kind of the keeping the suspense up to keep people on the edge of their seats, so to speak. Just like, oh man, who's gonna get it? Who out of the random extra people that they have in this movie is going to get it? Because it's obviously gonna set up that like there's going to be three people that live at the end of this one. Sorry for spoilers for anybody. Uh, we also have, I believe, Caitlin's character who is to have a brother named Michael. Let me reiterate this. So the main female character has a way younger brother that's named Michael, and this makes no sense. I'm like, why doesn't Caitlin just have Michael be her son? Because really, she's old enough. She could have had a son. Because where is this brother eventually going to be handed off to his parents? Because where is the backstory of all of a sudden Caitlin is to get Michael from her parents? Because why is Caitlin taking care of Michael? Was there never a backstory to help us understand why Caitlin is taking care of her brother? Were they to have ever said, they should have just said that he was her son. That would have been okay for, I don't know why they had to do the brother thing. That just seems so weird in this story. And that's the thing that I'm like, okay, this just doesn't make sense. Other than that, I think everything else is to be quite possibly fine enough or good enough. Some people may have problems with this film at any point in time, and I can honestly understand that. Um, the whole lighthouse also having their lighthouse light not being on could also baffle and confuse people also, 'cause it's like, hey, why is it so convenient that that this lighthouse switch has to be turned on to eventually, like, shouldn't a lighthouse be having its light be on at all times? And why is it that this like this lighthouse seems to just have like this kind of flimsy, just kind of working mechanical thing with it? Uh, Man, they should really do something to just really fix this lighthouse at all times to make sure it's always working. Cause there's some goofy things going on here, coincidentally tied to this whole moment. But other than that, like I like this movie. I find it to be so good. It's so fun to watch. Like I'll watch this 100 times over and over and over, and still like it, still enjoy it. It really has a good story overall. Even though I might myself have just complained about a number of things. So, with that said, what is the teen up version of this movie? Well, like I had said, this movie is to be like a Tooth Fairy kind of concept, and so back in the day, back in the old time frame, we end up having a woman who is to be called Matilda Dixon, who is to eventually go and give kids money in exchange for their teeth. What is this woman doing with this teeth? I just don't want to know. Like I'm just thinking of that one Family Guy episode where like the girl is just taking all these teeth and just slapping them all on a bed, and then she like drops on them and she's like, yeah, ah, yeah. Like what is she doing with his teeth? I just don't want to know. Like I just want to just have it be an ignorant bliss of what this woman is doing with these teeth. So it seems like the townspeople had found out that this woman was to have been exchanging money for teeth. And so maybe a lot of them just grew insane about, like, what is she doing with those teeth? Like, I need to know what she's doing with those teeth. We need to just lynch mob this woman and just burn her to a stake or something. Because, like, I'm trying to figure out what she's doing with these teeth and I can't figure it out. So we just have to just go burn her and just like torture house, and because I'm just ticked because I don't know where these teeth are. I don't know what she's doing with these teeth. So we just got to flame on her house. So all of a sudden, so this woman is to supposedly be wearing this plastic mask for the rest of her life, to eventually kind of not showcase to people the scarring and the humiliation that this woman had went through. And so weirdly, I guess after this person was to die, I guess she was to vow forever that she was going to haunt these people when anyone was to have their one last tooth left. Like, hey, you better not look uh, for Matilda, because they didn't come up with a weird name with this woman. Like, they just say it's like, oh, like, remember that story? But they didn't, like, come up with, like, a singular name for this character. But I guess they end up calling her like the creepy tooth fairy or whatever. So yeah, so let's go into this. So the beginning of the movie, we are to have a younger Kyle that is to seemingly be going and talking to his mother, and so Kyle is kind of like brewing in his head whether or not he's going to ask Caitlin to this dance, and so he's kind of talking to his mother about this. And so Kyle's mother is to go off and just be like, "Hey, like this is your last tooth, huh?" And Kyle's like, "Yeah, it's my last tooth," because Kyle was in like some like bathroom somewhere and kind of taking this tooth and ripping it out. So all of a sudden, Kyle's mother is to leave, and Caitlin is to weirdly sneak into this guy's house. I'm like, what is this? Like Scream? Like, hey, the both Darkness Falls monster and the Scream characters, they look technically the almost exact same. Put them side to side, they almost look like the exact same thing. It's weird. So so Billy is to sneak into Sydney's home, just the same as Caitlin is to sneak into Kyle's home. And it's weird kind of seeing the younger variation of Caitlin, because I'm like, oh my god, this is the girl from the same girl, because I had seen the show American Gods, and I was like, oh my god, I knew her from somewhere, but I couldn't quite place it, and I'm like, oh my god, this has to be it, because I've seen this movie uh, a few times. Like I don't know, I every time it's on TV, eventually I'll catch it. But I don't think I ever really caught it in the very early stages of the movie. I probably caught it like mid, like probably right around when we get to the actual hospital spot, where eventually the power is starting to go out. Like, and then on. That's usually where I get it, or I'll usually get it during the bar scene when I get it on TV. So younger Kylan and Caitlin are talking, and so uh, Caitlin is mentioned that Kyle, oh, you lost a tooth, huh? You lost all your baby teeth, huh? So you're becoming a man, huh? So Kyle is to eventually just kind of tell Caitlin before she's to kind of leave because they're just kind of talking about like uh, their their stuff, their normal kind of stuff, and so Kyle asked Caitlyn, "Hey, like, would you want to go to me with this dance? Like, like guys are supposed to ask the girls, so I thought maybe I should go and finally do this because his mom is like, well, hey, like, yeah, like Caitlyn knows that she likes you and you like her, so like, you might as well ask her to this dance." So Caitlyn is just like, yeah, like I knew that you would probably ask me to go to this dance, and like I already told my mom, and she's cool with it, and like she can go and like pick us up and eventually take us to this dance, and like just be ready by like 7 or something. And Kyle's like, okay, cool. So Caitlyn ends up going and going off into her un weirdly sneaking out from where she snuck into. So Kyle gets ready for bed and is to bizarrely just have a nightmare, which all of a sudden just wakes him up. I don't know what his nightmare was. Maybe he was thinking of Nightmare on Elm Street, or maybe he was thinking of Scream. I don't know. Maybe he was thinking of some kind of movie, and it just woke him the F up. So Kyle is to have been awoken up, and so it seems that Kyle is to have kind of like seen a thing, heard a thing, and so Kyle is to have his like grab his flashlight and put his flashlight under his bed and have it on. And so, but eventually, Kyle is to, of course, spot this tooth fairy ish like character called Matilda. So, eventually, of course, Kyle is to scream bloody murder because he sees a monster in his room. So he runs off to go and tell his mother about the monster of which that he has seen. And so Kyle has his bathroom light on, and so Kyle's mom's like, "Well, like I'll go in there and I'll check what's up. Like I'm not gonna turn on a light in or anything because I'm assuming that I'm probably gonna die soon. So might as well not even turn on a light because I know I'm just gonna get consumed by this monsterish thing." Um, did I go into spoilers already? Because I think I've started to tell this story anyways. Did I? No? Well, spoilers now. I don't even know if I said anything. HBO Max, check this out. I don't know, I just got lost in the movie and now I'm not going to stop because. Did I say spoilers? Good God, I don't even know. My mind is a foggy haze of things. Uh, sure. So I'm saying it now if I didn't say it before. Go and check out the early thing. I just got caught up in the movie. I like this movie. It's an enjoyable thing. So I'm just caught up in it. So like everything before what I said and at this point is all gone in my whole mind. So spoilers if I didn't say anything. I don't know if I did the whatever. I just started talking about it. Anyways, so my life is a blur. So it's even seconds ago, even minutes ago. Anyways, so pushing on. So, uh, Kyle's mother ends up getting taken by the Tooth Fairy because, like, she really wants to go and have a bridge partner, or maybe she needs some hot fudge somewhere. I don't know. But Kyle's mother is to now be vanished upon, and so Kyle is to go into his bathroom and is to just hide in the tub until the sun is to rise. And so Kyle then, I guess, calls the police afterwards and is to say, it's like, well, it seems like Kyle doesn't have any other family beside his mother. And so I guess he's going to have to just be like sent through the system, kind of put through foster care and everything like that. So eventually younger Caitlin is to go and watch on as Kyle is to be just kind of in his PJs, kind of nestled with his blanket, and he's just kind of like he's really just traumatized. So we eventually find out in this movie when Kyle is to give Caitlin an update when he eventually talks with her again, like what he had been doing. That supposedly he had went through foster care that eventually led him into a family, which eventually led him to be working at certain casinos at Vegas for whatever reason. So now transitioning and pushing on. So now we have X amount of years later. And so Kayland is to have a brother, this still bothers me, named Michael, who seems to be in the same kind of sticky situation as technically Kyle was, even though she doesn't barely even know if that was to have really just happened to Kyle or not. Like, how could she have known? Because this guy was ripped away from her life and then he was gone. So I would have thought that Kyle would have just moved to a different state just because you would have thought, like, Kyle would have just been like, dude, I'm getting freaking out of here. I don't want to become like the joke of the town, or I don't want to be this person that ends up getting bullied for the rest of my life, because that's bound to happen. So Kayland is to eventually try to figure out how to deal with Michael's situation, because Michael is deathly afraid of the dark. So much so that eventually he's to be at this hospital, and a nurse by accident is to kind of put some shades in the curtains, and Michael ends up getting kind of scared and ends up screaming. So Caitlin ends up running in to realize that the nurse is like, "Oh, I forgot. Like, I didn't realize. I just kind of shut the blinds, and I didn't know any better." So eventually, Caitlin is to call Kyle and is to eventually ask him. It's like, "Well, hey, like, uh, it seems that coincidentally my brother is kind of going through some things, some nightmarish, night terror kind of things. And it sounds like, from what I can remember, that eventually, like, you had that same problem, and like it was extremely difficult to even get a hold of you or anything like that. But hey, like now that I finally did get a hold of you, like, how did you deal with this problem?" And Kyle, who is to be in this uh, place of his, surrounded by flashlights and surrounded by all these like batteries and whatever, Kyle is to answer this phone. At first, thinking that this is some kind of prank or some kind of joke that somebody's pulling on him, and Kaylin is like, "Oh no, like, hey, it's like I was a friend of yours, like hey, just like I'm just trying to like catch up on things, but I'm also like, hey, my brother is dealing with this same problem, so how did you deal with it?" And Kyle is like, "Well, I didn't." Because we end up finding out that Kyle has gone into taking several medications that are to be antipsychotics, and he is to have a number of flashlights at the ready for any problem that is to otherwise arise. So eventually, Caitlin is to just be like, "Well, is there any way that I can have you come back into town to just kind of talk to uh, my brother and kind of see if there's anything that you can do, kind of thing. And so Kyle eventually just comes on down to eventually see Michael and just to talk to him. So like I feel like there's not that kind of conversation, but I think Kyle, being a good guy, ends up doing this anyways. So Kyle heads back into town to eventually go and see Michael, and so he ends up having a conversation with him, and Kyle is to immediately give Michael this flashlight and say, "Here you go, like this is your like this is your broadsword, if anything." So eventually Michael is to tell Kyle that, hey, she's after me, like you know who I'm talking about, and Kyle's like, what, like uh did you lose no wait, he ends up saying that to Caitlin. And Michael is to tell him, like, you know what I'm talking about, like you know about her, you know who she is, and she's coming for me. And so Kyle eventually is to kind of ignore what Michael's saying, and because really he wants to just deny the truth. Plus, Michael is on, or Kyle, Kyle is on several different medications, and plus also he just wants to basically just make it seem like none of all of this event was to really just have happened or been true or whatever, because Kyle has spent a lot of years in the light, not having a real problem with this whole Tooth Fairy situation. So Kyle is to eventually go and talk to Caitlin and say, like, hey, did your brother recently lose his last tooth? And Caitlin's like, well, yeah. It's like Kyle is just like, okay, well, um, maybe there is some kind of truth of what he is saying. And so, because eventually it takes Kyle to go with Larry forcefully, because Larry's like, hey man, like, you're back in town, I want to have you come to a bar and just share a drink with me. And Kyle is to obviously refuse, but Larry's just like, come on man, just one drink. So Kyle goes to this bar and is to have Larry kind of buy him a drink, but Kyle is to refuse because reasonably, like, he has medication that is to just say, don't take this and drink or consume alcohol. So eventually, while Larry is to get this drink, all of a sudden there's to be this one bar patron that is to be at this bar who is to notice Kyle, and this is to be a guy named Ray. Ray is to just be like, oh man, that guy over there, he killed his mother, and like, why did they let him back into this town, and so on and so forth. This guy's like, he killed his mother, even though there's no real proof that that had ever happened. Like, I guess since he was the only one in the house, I guess he was the only culprit to this whole thing. But really, eventually Kyle would ask like the police officers eventually, like, how many like weird cold cases of murders has there been in this town, how many missing cases has there been, and so on and so forth. So eventually Ray goes over and confronts Kyle and is to take his beer from him, and is to eventually desperately ask for Kyle to go and fight him in the parking lot. So eventually Kyle wants nothing to do with Ray, and so really just Kyle is to just go back to Larry's car to eventually just kind of wait things out. Eventually Kyle is to try and confront, or Ray is to try to confront Kyle, and eventually they end up going and kind of having this stumble fight into the of course forest, where eventually Kyle is to realize that he is to have dropped his flashlights. So eventually, Kyle is to run to try to get to the nearest light, and Ray is to mention it's like uh, that. Hey, nobody's gonna get me in my forest. Like Kyle, come back here. Like let's go another round. So all of a sudden, Kyle is to be grabbed into the forest and be taken, and so Kyle is to go back and go with Larry to eventually because I want to do this perfectly, because why were the cops there putting two together? Okay. Yeah. So what ends up happening is that I'm trying to line this up perfectly, because I'm like, why is it that um I'm so confused. Uh, so I want to try to let me pause this for a second. All right. So what ends up happening is that Kyle has to go back to the to Larry and say, "Hey, we're gonna get the heck out of here." Uh, we have Michael, who is to eventually be going with Caitlin, and they're going to be doing some experiment on Michael, putting him in some uh, kind of container thing, and or kind of X-ray, or kind of like an MRI thing, to kind of shut all the lights off on him, so eventually he can eventually just realize that the darkness won't hurt him. Because eventually there's to be at one point again where Michael is to eventually go and be so afraid of the dark that he is to, of course, get hurt by the Tooth Fairy, but all the other people are to see is that Michael is weirdly hurting himself, because supposedly Michael's brain is so like afraid of this whole like thing that is only within his head, that he like his mind wants to prove that it's real, and so his mind is forcing him to hurt his own self, when really that's not what's going on here. That it is supposedly in this movie a Tooth Fairy character that is hurting Michael, but no one else is to see that. So they decide to put him in this dark tank or whatever, this MRI machine, to eventually leave him in darkness, so Michael can eventually realize that the darkness isn't going to hurt him. Michael was to also have said to Kyle at some point that he was really tempted to just turn all the lights off and just let the Tooth Fairy take him and let this be over, instead of Michael having to live in fear, so maybe he might get to this situation. So Kyle goes and takes Larry and is to eventually uh, have. Like, I'm getting so confused between these situations here, of eventually kind of like, because we have Kyle who's twice being put into prison for, I guess, two different situations. So because eventually Kyle goes to jail because supposedly Ray is to have gotten torn apart, and so they naturally assume it's Kyle, because like the bodies are to be similar with one another, and so they naturally assume that it's Kyle that's doing this, which isn't the case. So eventually, Larry is to bail out Kyle for just Kyle to eventually go back into prison again. So But then Kyle is to take Larry with him to try as quickly as possible to make it to this hospital that both Caitlin and Michael are to be at. And because Larry and Matt, who is this police officer, was to go out in the woods to go and try to find Ray's body, which eventually Ray's body ends up falls upon Larry, and so Larry is desperately crying to Matt, like, "Hey, this body's on me." So, like, I hoped that I kind of gotten that into a perfect way about doing things. So, and so when they find Ray's body, they immediately go and put and arrest Kyle, and then eventually they have Larry bail him out, and so Kyle is to, of course, uh, desperately tell Larry, "Hey, like, I'm gonna hold a gun to you. Like, I'm gonna get all these flashlights, and I'm gonna get a gun from out of this case. And while you or this person isn't gonna notice this." So Kyle is to eventually go with Larry and tell Larry that he needs to desperately, as quickly as possible, get him to the hospital before Michael is to go and do this procedure, kind of putting him in this darkness. So Kyle is to quickly uh, go on to try and stop this procedure, and so he ends up having to forcibly like hold a gun on these people. And I guess with the whole situation that ends up happening with Larry, where uh, eventually Larry is to eventually crash this car, and then Larry ends up getting taken, and then Kyle ends up kind of quickly getting in the car and driving off. I guess that's just another case where it seems that, oh, like Kyle had killed another person. I'm naturally assuming that now. So, but Kyle goes off and is to eventually kind of stop this whole procedure being done, and that's where he is to get arrested again, to eventually he is to be in put into this police station's prison cell. And so here's where we start to kind of have some weird, goofy things going on with this town, where it seems like they are to seemingly lose power for a number of places, and it seems like they're also to have these kind of weak emergency lights. So all of a sudden, Kyle is to desperately plead with everybody to have their flashlights on, to eventually stay in the light, and they're like, "Yeah, whatever, shut up." So, because eventually Kyle is to finally now have to break it to Matt of what's really actually going on. He's telling the actual truth, and Kyle is like, "Yeah, you remember that old story that we were told? Yeah, it's really true." And Matt is like, "Yeah, like I can't believe you." So Matt is to eventually go and investigate what the noise is, and so Matt ends up going out to kind of go through these like this one record room to eventually find out that he accidentally is to shoot some dog, and so he ends up heading on back. So all of a sudden, we end up starting to have certain people in this precinct all start being grabbed by this Tooth Fairy Esh like character. And so one by one, we start to get to see people start getting nabbed. Uh, People are trying to shoot this Tooth Fairy, but what good does it really do? So we just get to some point where eventually Matt is to just desperately kind of plead to like with people to stay in the light and whichever. So eventually now, like, I guess Matt is to really start believing Kyle of what he was to actually say. And so eventually, of course, Kyle is to immediately have these flashlights out to eventually save Matt's bacon and to really like believe Kyle's story. So Kyle is to desperately plead with Matt that they need to get to this hospital to go and find Michael because this thing is coming for him. So so eventually Matt is to be eventually coming into the hospital, crashing his way through these doors with this vehicle, but that kind of comes later. So Kyle eventually is to make it all the way up to where eventually uh, Caitlin and Michael are to be. So what ends up happening is that Caitlin and Michael are to be underneath this bed with this flashlight, and so eventually, like the Tooth Fairy is eventually going and trying to like scare these two from out of under this bed. They end up rolling out of the bed. They end up kind of like scrambling to eventually go and find some kind of lidded place, and then eventually Kyle is to arrive to have them go into this elevator. Well, when they start going through the elevator, we immediately have it to where all of a sudden the elevator is to start to lose um, parts of it because we have the Tooth Fairy that just kind of is tearing through the lines or whatever of the elevator, which is to cause Kyle to now have to forcibly open this door like manually, and so all of a sudden we end up seeing this doctor and this nurse there. We're like, hey, like it seems like you guys are in trouble. Let me help you guys out. Uh, so Kyle is to get Michael and Caitlin and himself out of this elevator in the nick of time, of course. So now we have to really just play the light game here where eventually they start to go through this stretch of hallway and Kyle is to eventually go and like try to like hold the light up to see if like it has a reflection. And so we have these two nurses and this doctor and these three other people who are trying to all like kind of tightly go next to this like light and hallway and whatever, because of course Kyle is to lose all of his flashlights in the elevator. Man, you would think for how many times that this guy would have numerously lost these flashlights at some point, you would have thought he would have had some kind of like taping mechanism or some kind of Velcro situation that he would have on his pants at like all times, like have some like Velcro situation where he's like, hey, here's a flashlight. Luckily, I have these on my pants all the time because you never know when I'm gonna need one. Um, or you would think that this guy would just have like glow in the dark clothes because why wouldn't that be a thing? Or probably considering it's now in more modern time, we would probably just have this guy who's to have this cell phone with a flashlight on there like all the time. And that would be like kind of the hindrance of whatever, because considering everybody's to at least have a flashlight, you would think like this thing would probably get beaten by a flashlight, or probably even just a real, just legitimately camera phone. Just be like, hey man, here's proof that this monster thing exists. Like, I have proof because you would think maybe this thing would be a thing that you could take a photo of it. Yes? No? No? Well, oh well. So, or recently it would be a bad thing to take a photo of this thing because then eventually the whole town would know what this thing looks like, and technically it's like looking into its eyes and whatever, but who knows? I don't know exactly how that would exactly work out or pan out or whatever. So, so eventually we end up getting through this hallway and everybody's kind of squeezing against this wall as much as humanly possible. All of a sudden the light goes out and Kyle with everybody's like, dude, let's scramble, let's get out of here. One of the nurses ends up getting grabbed. Boo hoo for her. She's an extra. she'll just be called the nurse in the credit scene, sadly enough. So they skedaddle, and so now they are to have to forcibly figure out a way to try and fly down a stairwell. Basically, meaning that considering they can't use the elevator, now they have to basically jump from the top of the stairs down to the very bottom and hope they don't get injured along the way. So, Caitlin and Michael are to, of course, jump down this whole flight of stairs first, and they make it. And so now, Kyle and this other nurse and this doctor to have to all jump. And Kyle is like, well, hey, like, we're probably not all going to make it, but at least there's like kind of multiple chances that any one of us will probably make it out of here. So they go flying down this flight of stairs, and the other random nurse ends up getting grabbed. So, and that I guess has Caitlin and Michael kind of jumping down their flight. Or no, wait, maybe they stay. Maybe they stay and wait for both. No, I think they jump down the flight of stairs too. So now we have the second round of people jumping, and so coincidentally, the random doctor ends up getting. Or no, wait, does he end up getting grabbed? No? Yes? I'd like to think yes. So Kyle ends up making it down the flight of stairs, and so all of a sudden we end up having Matt. No wait, no wait. Fix that. The doctor doesn't get grabbed, but eventually he gets grabbed shortly thereafter. So Matt is to go and crash his car through the hospital, and so now everybody's going and getting in this car, getting to as close as light as humanly possible. So they're going to go and drive off to the lighthouse. That's their master plan. So eventually, what ends up happening is that the doctor is to eventually get grabbed through this one window and eventually taken, and that's what ends up happening to him. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, you got to keep this suspense up, I guess. So they end up going to this lighthouse. No one else gets grabbed until we get to this lighthouse. So all of a sudden, Matt is to seemingly know the 411 about this lighthouse and how to operate it and whatever. Luckily for him, right? Somebody has to figure it out, I guess, out of known about how to do this lighthouse thing. So we come to find out that it seems that this lighthouse is leaking gasoline, and so that's the reason why this lighthouse isn't working properly. And so now both Kyle and Matt, because evidently the lanterns that they have on them are starting to lose their light, and so now we have both Matt and Kyle having to desperately try to fix this gasoline line so that way eventually this lighthouse will eventually work. So Kyle is to have to like fix this this leak, and Matt is just kind of hovered over trying to give this guy the best amount of light possible. But Kyle is to be worried that Matt is not close enough to the light. And of course, the tooth fairy-ish like person goes and grabs Matt. And so all of a sudden, Matt is to fix the leak, but then he ends up kind of falling over and breaking this lantern. And so eventually, both Caitlin and Michael are to lose their lantern, but luckily we had Michael who ends up having this one little light, this one little kind of thing where he like twists, and it's to have this kind of certain kind of light, technically. So eventually what ends up happening is they have to now scramble to eventually try and turn this lighthouse on. And so eventually what ends up happening is that Kyle is to scramble to tell Caitlin and Michael to get closer to where the light is, and so they do. And so eventually Michael is to try and squeeze into this one smaller location because Kyle can't get to it to turn this lighthouse on. And so eventually, finally, Michael at the last ditch second is to, of course, to be able to turn this lighthouse on. So all of a sudden, the lighthouse is to be on, and all of a sudden, the tooth fairy monster all of a sudden ends up getting hit, and we're thinking, oh, so that kills the monster. We're done with this. Yeah, she's dead. Also, all the police officers in the police precinct all died horrifically. Just so that we have that kind of in hand. Like, I didn't think that I was going to go through and mention every single person's deaths or whatever, because there's a lot of deaths that happen in there. So, as well as now Matt's. So, eventually, what ends up happening is that Kyle is to eventually go up to this lighthouse to find out that Matilda isn't all that quite dead. And so now Matilda is to grab Kyle and to kind of hoist him up. And so now evidently there's some sparks flying, there's some situations happening. So reasonably, Kyle is to take these sparks that are to be coming from this lighthouse thing and to start to light his arm on fire. And so now Kyle turns to Matilda and he's like, I see you, B word. And then he ends up hitting her with with these flames to kind of douse her so that way she burns. And that is to have finally taken this character out and to kill her off. Which I'm like, oh, okay, so yeah, you have to kind of recreate the situation that kind of turned her into this thing to eliminate her. And plus also, what would be the best light kind of thing would just be that. So now we are to assess or assume that all of this is wrapped up, happy ending with the exclusion of any number of people that ended up dying during this whole situation. But it seems like the problem is to be over. So now transition us to eventually have like this kid eventually losing his tooth. And so eventually his dad is to comfort him and say, hey, good night, son. And so eventually the mother ends up coming in and is to like transition the quarter for the tooth. I'm like, hey, like, there's some kids watching this. Like, don't ruin it for them. Don't ruin the secret. Some youngins could be watching this thing. Come on. Like, don't tell them the Tooth Fairy's not real. Like, don't ruin this thing for them. I know it's like a PG-13 movie, and probably a number of people have probably been told, like, how the thing had, how the, like, you know, like, how the real bread's been made, so to speak. But still, like, any kid at probably any age could have probably just seen this movie because it's PG-13. Like, I don't think there's enough cuss words in here for eventually a kid to just be like, be scarred for life or whatever if they see this film. Like, there isn't any, like, actual, like, there isn't too much of a vicious, violent thing in here because I think it's PG-13. And so, like, and there's no, like, nobody's going around topless or naked or whatever. So you got that too. So, with that said, yeah, I still enjoy this movie. It's still good. It's still fun. It was very goofy to figure out certain spots though, because eventually I was like, God, am I going to get this all right? Am I going to figure out how to, like, kind of talk about this in certain spots? Because I knew I was going to get confused and I knew I was going to have to take some time to figure things out. But then I ended up just kind of just saying, like, I'm just going to blurt this out and hopefully that works out. So with that said, considering how short this movie really is, I'm going to get the heck out of here. I enjoy this movie. I really like it. I don't know why I do. I think I just like the concept, the whole like actually having to skin the cat to avoid the darkness. Um, like I think that that's a cool concept. I wish movies would have done that a heck of a lot more, but like I don't think they did. But there was also some points in time where I think I reviewed certain movies where I did kind of say it's like, yeah, this does kind of feel like Darkness Falls. Like it feels like that for whatever reason. Um, Maybe Midnight Man might have had that kind of thing, or there's probably a lot of movies where I think, uh, like I did kind of like, yeah, I think Midnight Man with Robert Englund is kind of like Darkness Falls. There might be like a ton of movies that do feel like Darkness Falls, but they have their own kind of element of like of difference, kind of for their movie. But yeah, I think that's all that I want to say because of how short this movie is. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.